I typically don't like to focus on this because the channel is focused towards spiritual things, towards spiritual growth. But the Bible applies to so many areas of our life. We just need to consider this. So, how does the Bible apply to modern day gun ownership? Now, recently I was watching Bill Maher, and he had Colion Noir on his channel, and I was impressed. And then I found out this happened about 4 years ago, and this kind of makes sense why Bill Maher seems to be leaving the extreme left and heading towards middle ground, and I think he will actually end up going further. I was actually going to make a video that you can't be honest, searching, and intellectual and remain ignorant of gun ownership. But that's for a whole different video. But he had Colion Noir on there, who is very pro-gun, and he's a very pro-gun advocate. But there was a couple of things that Colion didn't key in on well enough, and maybe he missed these things. But Bill Maher asked him a couple of harder questions that I don't know that Colion was ready for, and I am actually answering them off the fly. So that could be problematic in and of itself. But one of the questions that he was asked was, if the military is always going to have bigger guns than we are, then what is the point of us having big guns? Like, why in the world does a civilian ever need an military-type rifle? And strategically, I just ask anybody to actually think about this for a moment. Now, Colion's response was very good. He's like, listen, we actually used military-type rifles, our muskets and our rifles and our guns of yesteryear against a tyrannical government. And then he mentioned there's other times there's governments that have taken away the guns before they could oppress the people, and we've seen this time and time and time again. And then there's places like Australia, and then there's some in Europe and places that have said, hey, don't give up your guns. We regret giving up our guns. That puts the people at a terrible disadvantage. But the question was asked almost as if it's like it's a one-up point, but like our military has M1 tanks and F-16 fighters and, satellites in the sky. I mean, what on earth could a civilian ever do against that? Please just think. Just think about this. In a civil war, and we don't want there to be a civil war. Please, Lord, don't ever let there be a civil war in this country. Another one, that would be awful. But in a civil war, people know where the soldiers live, or the soldiers have to go get groceries, or there has to be a supply chain to hold the strength of the military together, and all of that would be vulnerable and exposed to the mass of citizens around it. And so a military would be very hard-pressed to go against a even moderately armed people. So America has always believed in providing their people arms for the sake of their protection. Now you might wonder, how do Christians fit in this? Well, the Lord was very clear, at least at one point. He told his disciples, if you don't have a sword, you need to go sell your cloak and buy one. And they were like, we got two here. And Jesus was like, that's enough. And he didn't explain more than that, but he also didn't explain less than that. And then when John was asked by some of the disciples that were coming in, what should we do? And he's like, well, go be good soldiers. Well, there is a need for soldiering. There is a need for government. And our government was crafted very well, where the people, the populace, are part of the military and the police force. That is the purpose of gun ownership. It is spread so far and wide that it'd be hard to completely corrupt and control everybody all at once. That's the way this ties together. And so the question is, if someone ever asks, like, why do people need firearms? They can't take on the government. I mean, they can't take on the military. Well, yes, they can in all their vulnerable places. And so it just makes sense that you wouldn't want to get into that type of engagement. Now, obviously, soldiers aren't going to want to necessarily fight against civilians. And so if they realize that, hey, these are my brothers, sisters, or cousins, etc., they would be a lot less likely to engage them, and there would probably be a higher attrition rate. And so an evil government would have a very hard time taking its military and turning it on its people, but yet that does happen. But it almost always happens in places where the populace isn't well defended. So I think that just kind of explains itself. And then the next question that I don't know that Colin handled to the utmost degree, and I would sure he's handled many concepts better than I can, and probably has answered this question 1,000 times over since then. But just in response to this one video, so he was also asked, like, Colin said, we should arm the teachers to protect the children. And that's a very strong argument. But the response was from Bill Maher is like, well, the teachers don't want to fight. Ha! Really? They don't want to, huh? I would like to know the statistics on how many teachers were involved in the riots just 2 years ago, or how many educated were amongst those that were stirring up problems just 2 years ago. We know that some were exposed, but there's a reason that the rest want to wear masks, is because they don't want their identities exposed, because it would be very bad for them. And it's probably because they are in influential positions. I know that's not a complete link, but I really wish that some would just think about this. And then if people don't want to protect children, then you have to push the idea and concept of duty. What about duty? And if no one has any duty to anyone, then our country is not going to hold together in any shape, form, or fashion. Because then if you hand everything over to the police, what duty do they have to the people? You still got pay in common with those two things. Of course, one would be more dangerous of a position than the other. But we're talking about very unlikely events. And if schools become armed, then in that case, there will be a lot less mass shootings going on in schools, because it's just not as fulfilling for a psycho madman to run around if he knows he's going to get shot in 30 seconds of being in the school system. But funny with this is, since most of our teachers are females, and this huge push in our country now is for females to be male-like, or females to be in the military, then why not push females to carry firearms? Now, I'm not totally in line with this push towards masculinity, but I would just like to ask the left to think about these things. Be consistent through and through in what you think about. And I don't necessarily think that a woman shooter is necessarily masculine. But if the push-off is, well, I just don't want to, what about the push towards duty? Or what about all the other areas that have been pushed? Some things to think about. And I'm just glad to see that Bill Maher is even saying, hey, it's kind of making some sense to me. And the more you're honest about it, and the more you search it out, and the more you meditate over it and actually get real research and facts, you're like, oh, this is beneficial. And I'll throw one last thing in there for good measure. Just recently, the CDC pulled down their positive gun statistics. What? Because of political pressure, the CDC pulled down their self-defense gun statistics that claim that somewhere between 60,000 to 2.5 million times per year, a gun is used positively to deter crime. That's pretty significant. But because of political pressure, that statistic has been pulled down. Why? Because that statistic is powerful, because it speaks truth about gun ownership and responsible gun carrying and what it can do to protect people. Now, then you have to wonder, like, who doesn't want us to be protected? Who doesn't want our children to be protected? With that, is it really science if your statistics can be manipulated? And this is an outright example. And one of the problems that I'm finding again and again and again repeatedly is because of political pressure, because of competition, because of the nature of wanting to get ahead. A lot of statistics and a lot of scientific understanding is being tainted and manipulated for awful ends and reasons. And we need to stay abreast of these matters. Just some thoughts. Think them through.